Good evening. My name's Paul Milborn. I'm a member of staff here. I'm going to chair tonight's event. I'd like to welcome our guests from different universities. We've had a nice afternoon with Mara, which is nice to see. And I think some of you are joining us for dinner later on. This is the fourth John Murdoch Memorial Lecture. This year will be delivered by my old friend Henry Buller from the University of Exeter. But before introducing Henry, I just wanted to say a few words about this lecture. It was established to recognise one of our former colleagues, Professor John Murdoch, who was with us in the school for 10 years and was sadly taken away from us at the tender age of 51, 9 years ago. And during his time in the school, I think a lot of us in the audience who knew John's work would recognise that he developed a reputation for being one of the most gifted scholars working on the environment. His work cross-cutted even, human geography, sociology, environmental planning, and he did an awful lot of work to develop new understandings of the relationships between nature, space and society. And a lot of his publications on theorising food, the environment, on the complex relationships between the human and the more than human worlds remain amongst the most cited publications within human geography. So this lecture series, this particular lecture, is our way of remembering John, and in particular his intellectual contributions to the academy, but also I think the friendships he held with many of us in the room tonight. Each year we invite it says an eminent scholar, okay, Henry, working on environmental themes within the social sciences to present a lecture in John's name. We've even got a past speaker, Gail Davis is here tonight, who did the lecture a couple of years ago. So a few words about Henry. As I say, Henry is University of Exeter, a professor of geography there. I guess his two main areas of work that we know him from would be animal geographies, which is one of the reasons why he's here today. His work on animal welfare and rewilding in particular. His commitment to this theme is obvious from his personal webpage, if anybody's looked at that, where he's, I think people have, where he's pictured with what I can only describe as a cuddly rabbit, is it?
Yes, giant inflatable rabbit.
Giant inflatable rabbit, so there you go, that's commitment for you. And so that very much fits with John's work. And secondly, I think Henry is well known for his work in rural studies, both rural geography and I think rural sociology in terms of observing work, which again resonates with another of John's research interests. Past editor of Sociology Realis now, and written widely on these themes, as most of us know in the audience tonight. I also noticed from your website, Henry, that you're Director of Education, and I'm sure you'd be lucky to front questions or answer questions on the changing nature of teaching in higher education, or maybe over a glass of wine later. So in these terms, in terms of animal geographies, in terms of rural geography, Henry is well placed to deliver tonight's lecture, and we're really grateful that you could take the time to come and talk to us on the theme of animal matters. Henry's going to, or he's been instructed by Mara to talk for about 45 minutes. Which you'll endeavour to do, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for discussion, comments, maybe even some questions at the end. Henry.
That's great. Thank you very much, Paul. That was nice. Thank you, Paul. I think this series, the John Murdoch Memorial Lectures, is a fantastic idea. I feel very humbled to have been asked to do it, so thank you very much, Mara. I hope I do the series justice. So this is called Animal Matters, and I thought I'd start with this wonderful photograph, which I love. You might not know what it is. This is Brigitte Bardot on top of a horse. Bardot is an interesting figure. She, in a film with Jean Gabin, she famously compared her bottom to a chicken, which endeared me to her enormously, I think. And then, of course, in France now, Bardot is associated so much with animal liberation and animal rights. To some extent, she's personified that whole movement, at least certainly did within the 60s and 70s. And then you've got the sort of rather animal-like crowd of photographers surrounding her, which I think is fabulous. The fool, as the French would say, of the crowd. And then in the middle, the horse, who looks as if she's about to do a sort of pirouette, right in the middle. I just love that photograph, and it was the best thing I could think of to illustrate the title of this talk, which has got nothing to do with Brigitte Bardot or horses, but nevertheless. So I'm going to start this talk with this place. Some of you may know it from having been there. Some of you may know it from reputation. In the sort of geography of SSSIs, sites of special sociological interest, this is a very key place. This ranks up there with Derrida's bathroom, I think, and to some extent with Jane Bennett's storm drain. This is, for me, the Abbey Road, if you like, of current sociology. Where is this? This is the Bay of Saint-Brieuc in northern France, in the Côte d'Armor department, Saint-Brieuc Bay. Between 1987 and 1991, I spent 4 or so years working here in the Bay of Saint-Brieuc on a project funded by the French CNRS, the National Research Council. The project was to look at water pollution, pig farming and shellfish production, really, the interlinks between these 3 items. And as some of you will probably know, Saint-Brieuc Bay is one of the foremost sites in France from what they call conchiliculture or mytiliculture, which is essentially shellfish farming and shellfish capture, particularly mussels, though of course among sociologists we know best the coquille Saint-Jacques, of which I noticed this morning there's one up there in gold. The coquille Saint-Jacques, which of course are famous for theoretical ideas that I'm going to talk about in a moment. Unfortunately for the mussels of Saint-Brieuc Bay, and unfortunately for the coquille Saint-Jacques, the area around this sort of rather beautiful bay landscape is historically one of very small family farms, agricultural holdings, and it's seen over the last 30 years an absolutely explosive growth in intensive indoor pig farming. The region of Saint-Brieuc rapidly became, in the 1970s, the foremost pig production site in Europe, alongside the Brabant in the southern Netherlands. And here's some photographs from the pig units of the Saint-Brieuc Bay. I hope you can see with the lights. Both some of these pigs, if you like, are grain-fed on slatted floor systems, the ones you can see out here. Others are in some of the older buildings and are fed on straw-based systems with all the issues that produces. These pigs, the thousands of pigs around the Saint-Brieuc Bay, produce enormous quantities of slurry and animal waste, a great deal of which finds its way into the local rivers and eventually into the Bay of Saint-Brieuc. Either as a result of runoff from the rain, it's spread on the fields in order to sort of help the crops grow, and it rains, as it often does in Brittany, and the water washes down into the bay. Sometimes we've even seen farmers creep around at night and empty their slurry tanks directly into the bay to reduce the volume. Sometimes it's simply the overflowing of the slurry tanks when it rains very heavily. For whatever reason, all of this pig slurry seems to end up in the Bay of Saint-Brieuc. And the rivers of this part of Brittany, which are based on an impermeable granite substrate, as I'm sure you know, the rivers are the principal source of groundwater, of drinking water, because there's no groundwater supplies given the granite. And the rivers then rapidly became very polluted with nitrates, well in excess of 200 milligrams per litre, so well over the norm of the European Union, the mandatory defined maximum permissible concentration of 50 milligrams. So the sea and the Bay of Saint-Brieuc suffered a triple, I can never say this word, ignominy, you know what I mean, I-G-N-O-M-I-N-Y. The sea and the bay suffered a triple one of those. Firstly, the nitrate and phosphate levels from the slurry, from the pig slurry, rose significantly in the waters of the bay to dangerous levels, the nitrate and the phosphates. Secondly, a gradual process of ineluctable eutrophication began, leading to the proliferation of this glutinous green algae all across the bay and indeed in some of the neighbouring bays. So this is the algae that forms as a result of the rise in phosphate and nitrate levels coming directly from the pig slurry. And interestingly enough, horses, dogs, boars, and sometimes even bathers would kind of disappear into this miasma of green algae, never to be seen again. And the loss of 2 bathers over the last 5 years has been a particularly sort of incisive issue for trying to do something about it. The third ignominy, if you like, from the pig slurry was that bacteriological infection began of the mussels and other shellfish, which is called the periodic closure of shellfish sales from the bay. If that wasn't enough, the presence of the algae and the dying mussels then led to the explosive proliferation of the seagulls and other birds and the ineluctable decline of fish stocks in the bay. Finally, as anyone who's had the misfortune to descend from the TGV train at the nearby station of Lamballe will know, the whole region seems to smell of pig slurry and pigs. So I hope there's no one there from the Côte d'Amour tourist board here. I've just ruined their entire economy. It's a funny place, it really is. Anyway, our mission in the CNRS was to tie all of this together into some sort of series of causal pathways, the better to offer a workable management solution for the restoration of the bay's quality. That's what we were charged with doing. Now, there's an irony here, or in fact there's 2 ironies, which I want to explore. This is the first irony. The first irony then is that the original source of concern for all of this, the pig slurry, the water pollution, the interdiction on the sale of shellfish, was partly prompted by the fact that the small villages around the bay no longer seemed capable of winning the annual Breton Best Kept Village competition. And it was, if you like, out of this aesthetic concern that attention was eventually brought to the issue of pig slurry. Yet even then, as the causal link slowly became established between the practices of pig management and the pollution of the bay, the pigs themselves remained almost entirely absent from any form of accounting. The shellfish, the mussels were all in there. The coquille Saint-Jacques, of course, as high-value quality local food, received a lot more attention than the pigs, despite the fact that the pigs were the very centre of this issue. Their corporeality, their waste, their management, their behaviour was at the heart of this issue. The pigs were, to use that lovely phrase of Graham Harman, dormant objects, present but to a large extent denied any relational status in the accounting for what was going on in the bay. The second irony, I said there were 2 ironies from this work, the second irony of course was this, that a few miles up the coast, the French sociologist Michel Calon had been working on that groundbreaking research and paper using the same Bay of Saint-Brieuc, using the same coquille Saint-Jacques that we were looking at, and ironically, just the same scientists at Ifremer that we were talking to. A paper that he eventually published that we all know by heart, I'm sure. A paper that effectively launched actor network theory, or ANT as we call it, upon the world. Now, we knew nothing of this, which is kind of strange. Perhaps it says more about us as researchers in the CNRS than it does about Calon. Although the École des Mines, where Calon worked, was just a few hundred metres from the Sorbonne Institute where we were, we knew very little of this, originally published in L'Année Sociologie, but its real impact was when it later appeared in a book published in the US. For many of us in these laboratoires of CNRS, and certainly for me, and for some of the French researchers, and certainly for my PhD students at the time, all ironically working in Paris, it was this University of Newcastle paper, written in 1993 by John, and John's subsequent championing of both ANT and the work of Calon and John Law and Bruno Latour that somehow changed everything for all of us. And I just want to draw attention to this extraordinary document, which is not available anymore, unfortunately, but if anyone wants a PDF, I can send them the. Around this time, our CNRS laboratory organised a collective workshop with the University of Newcastle team. And although John himself couldn't make it, I remember sitting in a boat with Neil Ward. I don't know if any of you know Neil Ward. This is a very young Neil, looking a bit like Bono, I think, from U2. This is Neil and me sitting in a boat. I'm not there, I took the photo. Sitting in a boat in the Bay of Saint-Brieuc with the famous mussels behind us on the sticks. Neil and I spent a lot of time during that week and later in his hotel room talking about Latour, talking about We Have Never Been Modern, which had just been published, talking about John's paper on the use of A&T and his synthesis, if you like, of Calmel's work. And it really did change a lot of what we did, and for Neil it subsequently led to the book they wrote with Philip Lowe on animal pollution. I'm very much inspired by John's interpretation, if you like, of A&T and Calmel's work. So that's all an introduction, rather a long introduction, I apologise, but first 2 points to come from this introduction. First, the complete absence of the pigs from either our empirical investigation at the time or from our conceptualization of notions of agency and notions of actor. And second, at least for me, the bizarre introductory trajectory of actor network theory, and for many of us, the absolutely critical role that John played in proselytizing A&T as an approach. I remember only a few years after this, when I was a lecturer at the Sorbonne Institute of Geography, asking whether we ought to introduce our students to actor network theory, to be told that the only networks our geography students needed to know about at the time were those of the roads and the railways. So there's to some extent a sort of disciplinary blindness that was going on, I think, in a lot of disciplines, not just between geography and sociology in France, but elsewhere. So, taking all of that as my introduction, as a starting point, I really wanted to do 2 things in this talk. Which I could have called ants and pigs, but I thought that would be too silly. So the first thing I want to talk about is human animal studies and actor network theory, and the second I want to talk about is animal mattering. I hope that's of interest, really. First, I want to explore the idea that actor network theory, coupled with the emergence of what we might call animal studies or human animal studies within the social sciences, has undoubtedly brought animals into our analysis and into our explanation in a way that was simply unthinkable in the 1980s. I'm still amazed at how much we've progressed in our ability to account for animals. Yet, I guess what I want to also say is this more forthright accounting of the animal in social science and animal geography and so on, which is perhaps 10 to 15 years old, nevertheless remains largely entrenched so often in a sort of residual anthropocentrism, a residual humanism that to some extent belies its more radical project. A part of the reason for this, I think, is that human-animal studies were initially attracted to the sort of ontological radicalism of actor network theory and its rather seductive transgressing of those all-pervading divides of modernism, social, society, nature, and so on. And in doing so, I think we've perhaps been a little less attentive to the epistemological implications and possibilities of studying human-animal relations. So the second thing I want to do, after talking a little bit about the impact of A&T on animal studies, is to explore the question of what matters to animals, how we might understand this, and what implications a sense of mattering might have for a more inclusive, dare I say, symmetrical social science. I guess in doing that, what I want to do is to push A&T to deliver on its promise of an expanded epistemological realism. So, the first bit, animals and A&T. So I want to talk a little bit about animal geographers and other animal social scientists. It's funny, I've no trouble saying animal geographers, but when you say animal sociologists, it kind of has a different ring to it, doesn't it? It thinks about the anyway. The American Sociological Association has got its Animals and Society group, whereas the Associated American Geographers has got an Animal Geography Study Group. I think there's an interesting sort of way of using these disciplinary words. They don't quite mean the same thing, which intrigues me. Anyway, for animal geographers, for emerging animal geographers and other social scientists interested in human-animal relations, people who sought, I think in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, to actively to use that wonderful phrase of Jenny Walsh and Jodie Emmel, to actively bring the animals back in to our sociological and geographical accounting. For these people, I think A&T has been an incredibly useful and timely approach. On the one hand, actor network theory has been a stimulating and provoking theory that seeks to dissolve dualisms, to use that phrase, of which human, social, animal nature is just about the most categorical division of all. On the other hand, A&T, actor network theory, has brought a complex and innovative methodology which rests on that absolutely fundamental command: follow the actors, whoever they may be, whatever they may be, wherever they may be. One wonders really whether there could have been a new animal geography without the radical ontology of actor network theory, and its emphasis on ethnography, its emphasis on observation, its emphasis on performance. In one of the sort of key books that launched partly animal geography, certainly, and animal social science, Animal Spaces, Beastly Places, which we were talking about earlier this afternoon, edited by Chris Philo and Chris Wilbert, they describe A&T as, quote, rescuing the non-human things of the world for social science. They say it's not foolish to be talking about animals possessing a measure of agency and being capable of resisting, not just transgressing human norms, such as the spatial orderings of the city, the farm, or the zoo. Now, I don't want to trace the use of A&T in animal studies here and now. There's the short assessment of A&T, it's only about 300 words long, as method on animal geography in a piece I did earlier in Progress in Human Geography, and others have written very nicely about A&T, including obviously John Murdoch, far more eruditely than I have. Nevertheless, I think A&T has been of great value for us animal geographers and us social scientists. And if I might sum it up really quickly in 5 sort of bullet points, actor network theory and human animal studies has allowed us to move away from the preconditionality of the non-human, that assumption of the non-human, that categorization of the non-human that Derrida writes so well about. Actor network theory has allowed us to establish the animal, indeed animality, as a multitudinous assemblage. All sorts of different things contribute to the status and the being, if you like, of the animal, in whatever context it might be. But John Law writes beautifully about this notion of the animal as an assemblage. Actor network theory has facilitated a less exclusive notion of agency. It's not just humans that have agency, and that A&T allows us to track and observe and identify non-human agency. Actor network theory has provided us with what we might call an ethnographic thickness in the study of human-animal relations, allowed us to do a better, a stronger, deeper ethnography of how those relations act and operate. And finally, I think actor network theory has allowed animal geographers and other social sciences to move away from the purely representational accounts of human-animal relations that completely dominated human-animal studies up until the sort of mid-1990s, and are still very relevant. But I think we've moved on, and A&T has certainly allowed us to move on into less representational, more than representational, or dare I say, non-representational mechanisms for understanding those relations. And all that's been really good and very helpful. And I think back to all those pigs in the Bay of Saint-Brieuc, shut up, if you like, in their intensive housing units for 15, 20 weeks or however long it is before they're slaughtered. How little we took into consideration their agency. How little we took into consideration the manner in which they were assembled or deassembled, attached and detached in our search for causes and effects back in the mid-1980s. How horrified we would have been by A&T's claim that people and animals might be understood in the same terms. How horrified we would have been at the time by the idea that these pigs fait faire, as Latour would say, or would have it make to do, create the conditions for us to do. Yet of course that's exactly what they were doing. And I love it. Apologies for the English. This is the translation. This is actually a poster that appears by the Society of Pork Farmers in Brittany. It translates as, he grumbles, he farts, yet thanks to him, you eat healthily, safely, well, and breton. And this is a pig farmer in the Côte d'Armor, and there's a pig. This is the role of the pig. This is the pig that we failed really to account for in our 1980s study. So the examples of the use of actor network theory in animal studies are legion, and there are people in this room who've written about that very well and have been very influential. And again, the piece I did in Progress, the second one, provides a short review referring to a range of different published examples of actor network theory. And I think it's been a very, very wonderful tool, and it's been a very useful tool. And I still ask myself, you know, the question, could we have had this change, this animal turn in social science without the mechanisms of actor network theory and some of the ideas of ontological flattenings that accompany actor network theory? So that's my kind of love song to actor network theory. But, you know, as the musician Richard Thompson says, you can only sing love songs for so long, and then people just get bored with them. At some point, to make it interesting and dynamic, you've got to sort of introduce some element of contention. You've got to stir it up. So here I want to suggest that actor network theory, in the way it's been used, you know, and I still come back to the way in which it's used, the empirical examples, the way in which actor network theory has been used in animal studies rarely, in fact, delivers the symmetry and the agency with respect to non-human animals that it purports to offer, or doesn't always, let's be careful, deliver the symmetry and the agency with respect to non-human animals that it purports to offer. And I think this for two reasons. First, so often the networks and the assemblages that form the constructs and the dynamics of the world which A&T reveals are perhaps inevitably our own. Now, perhaps I'm being too optimistic or I'm hopelessly unrealistic about any alternative. But somehow the more than human worlds that A&T infused animal geographers and others make visible so often remain in essence steadfastly our own worlds, and the animals within them our animals. Entangled actants, if you like, but nevertheless in relational webs that are very often every bit as confining as the material structures we build around them. The second problem, I think, with respect to animal studies and animal geographers, is that A&T, as it's so often employed, fails to account for non-human mattering, or to go one step further, non-human intentionality. And maybe this is because it's a social science approach, and despite the best intentions of so many people nowadays, science and politics, the social sciences and the natural sciences remain largely distinct in multitudinous ways. So let me elaborate a little bit more on those two critiques, if you like. I must admit to a certain frustration with animal geography and human animal studies. You know, I go to lots of conferences and listen to lots of fascinating papers about animal geography, and far too often, perhaps, in these conferences, in the publications of animal geography, the overriding focus remains steadfastly the human. Perhaps that's all it should be, but I kind of expect more from it, really. Animal studies have helped us enormously. They've changed so many things. They've helped us understand how animals can make us better. They've helped us to think. You know, we go back to that wonderful Levi-Strauss, animals are good to think with. They play with us. They co-define our spaces and our spatial practices. Animals, through human animal studies, act as ethical touchstones for human behaviour. They are central now, in many ways, to human societies and our accounting of human societies. They help us to understand human relations. Animals and animal studies reveal the complex and often contradictory relationships between human action and the natural world. Their materiality, if you like, pervades us in all sorts of different ways, and human animal studies allow us to make visible that materiality and its influence upon our social structures and our spatial practices. Their very naming reveals us as what we are or what we think we are. They force us, as Carrie Wolf puts it, to, quote, rethink our taken for granted modes of human experience. Now all of that represents, I think, a tremendous achievement. And again, you know, you go back to your pigs of Saint-Brieuc in the late 1980s, and none of that existed. None of that would have been asked as relevant questions. These are the great successes of the animal turn in the social sciences. But to a great extent, it's still all about us. Under actor network theory, animals might be constructed as network effects, and they're still being seen as network effects. But as I say, these are very often our own networks, emerging from our own lines of sight. Now, in a terrific paper, which is I think my favourite paper that Jonathan ever wrote, he published in 1997, he kind of anticipated everything I'm saying now, which was just brilliant. He anticipated many of the concerns of A&T, but they haven't gone away, and in fact they're still just as robust, I think, as they were in the 1990s. Like McLean and Hassard's 2004 paper, which I'm sure everyone knows, which is a sort of very robust critique of so many of the precepts of actor network theory. John, in his paper, cites Collin and Yearley. We all know that well-known 1992 critique of Calon, and his account of the famous Saint-Brieuc-based scallops, in which Collins and Yearley argue that this is so much a human-centered account, in which the scientists of Ifremer and their knowledge define and represent the scallop's so-called agency, which is taken always at purely face value, defined by the scientists and their actions. For John, in that paper, the proponents of A&T adopt, in John's words, a rather Machiavellian perspective in their treatment of motivations and intentions of non-human actors, as if they don't really count in the search for agential symmetry. They are, to borrow Brian Masumi's lovely phrase, inclusively excluded. Others, like Andy Pickering, have been troubled by the intentionality within network constructions. Andy sees a clear distinction between the intentionality of humans and the absence of intentionality in non-humans, something we might immediately leap upon. Consequently, networks are generally the product of that exclusively human intentionality and ultimately selectivity. Now, to some extent, this is old stuff, and to some extent, we've been here before many times. Issues of symmetry and agency, inclusion, exclusion, ethnotricity, anthropocentricity, agency structure, equal treatment, distortion, politics. You know, all of these have been well debated in so much of the literature in the 2000s about A&T. John Law writes about it very well, and Latour offers trenchant responses to many of these critics in a range of publications. Though interestingly, John Law, I think, always kind of avoids some of the bigger metaphysical issues of humanism and non-humanism. And yet, we still come across these limitations all the time. The enduring popularity of A&T within animal studies, animal geographies, whatever, means that these concerns are still very relevant to us. I was at a PhD workshop in the Ardèche in France in August, and it was fabulous, and there were 6 of us academics and 12 PhD students, and we spent a whole week discussing their theoretical approaches. You know, you go around the room, what's your theoretical approach? A&T, every one of them. They all were looking at A&T, and to some extent I thought we were rather unaware of these critiques, particularly with regards to animals. So, as a proposition, I would like to suggest that when we think about animals, we ought to be much more careful about the issues of intentionality. I would like to suggest that when we're thinking about animals, we ought to be attentive to their particularities, and cannot simply dismiss them as a universal category devoid of any intentionality. Now, even Latour starts to believe this, I think. He writes in 2000, sometimes with Latour you can find a quote for anything. I mean, you know, you dig deep enough, you can get everything quoted in a Latour quote. But he writes here in 2000, it's a nice paper, if, in order to explain the subject's actions, the sociologist must have recourse to the force of society, it is because he no longer has at his disposal the immense repertoire of actions imprinted in the particularities of actors, which he dismisses almost out of duty as reified objects. The tools of actor network theory, John Murdoch tells us in that lovely 1997 paper, must not dominate the subjects. And sometimes even he argues A&T occludes some of the more significant aspects and particularities of the entities or actants under analysis. Now, of course, A&T is not the only investigative tool of contemporary human animal studies, though it's certainly a very popular one. The use of A&T in human animal studies has greatly strengthened the importance of ethnographic investigative methods in the social sciences, and they've given them a new legitimacy and a new pertinence. You know, follow the actors and all of that. But there's a similar challenge, I think, to be made to ethnography. As Ray Maddon and others have pointed out, the quality of communicative intersubjectivity and trust upon which effective ethnography partly depends is often extremely difficult to achieve with non-human subjects, particularly if we deny them agency and intentionality. If effective ethnography depends on ethnographers understanding the worldview, intentions, subjectivity and so on of their subject, then the problem of knowing the other is absolutely fundamental here, Thomas Nagel notwithstanding. Maddon then, in his lovely paper, feels that the thoughts of animals, quote, however constituted, are not able to be grasped in a manner that could exclusively inform a reliable, trustworthy ethnographic methodology. So how we represent animal actors, how we delegate authority to speak for animals, whether in A&T or in ethnography, becomes the critical methodological issue. Now, it has been said, as I said earlier, that A&T offers what they call, or what some people have called, an epistemological realism. What we know is what there is. And that's a departure from the so-called epistemological relativism of more standard sociology, which accepts that knowledge of the world is differentiated according to distinctive disciplinary positions. But when it comes to animals, in particular the animals we're closest to, the assumptions of knowing and of understanding through relational effects may often be very misleading. The intentional agnosticism, if you like, of actor network theory, particularly when it absolves itself of any consideration of non-human intentionality, can be, I think, highly problematic, and especially if we become genuinely concerned about something more than mere connectedness. Now, this is a good place to introduce Donna Haraway. Again, you can always find a good quote from Donna Haraway, and the lovely book, Modest Witness. So I'm aware that everything I'm quoting I'm calling lovely. Sorry. In the excellent Donna Haraway book, which I'm sure most of you know, she writes this, which I love: decentering the godlike, individualist, voluntarist human subject should not require a radical temperance project mandating abstinence from the strong drugs of networked desire, hope, and in Bell Hooks's provocative term for an effective and political sensibility, yearning. Now, I interpret that as Donna Haraway did at A&T. I might be completely wrong, but it works for me. So, let's talk about yearning. Let's talk about yearning, if you like, as what animals might yearn for, how they might flourish, both within and without our assemblages. Not as network effects, but as something far more. So I come to the sort of last section, really. I have no idea how I'm doing for time. We right, yeah. So this is the third of my 4 sections, really. And this is, I call this What Matters to Animals. In his recent book, Before the Law, here we go, Carrie Wolf delves into the world of values, and in particular how notions of value might be extended beyond the human, beyond the idea that non-humans are only valuable in terms of their relationship to humans. He argues, and I quote from the book, questions of value necessarily depend on a to whom it matters, but that to whom it need not be, indeed cannot only be human. Now this is so often where we come unstuck. This is where our animal geographies, our human animal studies, even our contemporary biopolitical thought so often lose their genuine post-humanist intent. What matters to animals, and crucially, how do we know? In early 2002, I think it was, Jonathan Murdoch rang me up to ask me whether I would be like to be part of a European research project that he, Mara, and others were putting together on farm animal welfare. This project became this, Welfare Quality. It was a project that actively sought to bring social science and animal welfare science together under a single research umbrella. And although I've been working in animal welfare issues, particularly with the RSPCA and others, that phone call from John and the subsequent research project we worked together on for a few years, I think it would be fair to say, opened up for me an entirely new conception both of the animal and of how we might integrate the study of animal-human relations into a new social science. And I want to spend the next 10 minutes really talking about that. For much of that project, and indeed for almost everything I have done since, I have been in the company of veterinarians, animal scientists, and ethologists. I've become something of a veterinary science camp follower. Some would say a veterinary science groupie in many ways. And for me, in many ways, this association with veterinary science, and particularly animal welfare science, has helped to confront just those elements that I see, or I saw, as lacking in a lot of animal geography, a lot of human-animal studies, even a lot of biopolitical thought. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to go into that sort of classic, what has animal welfare science done for us mode. And at the risk of oversimplifying an entire scientific discipline into 6 bullet points, let me briefly talk about some of the things that animal welfare science has done, I think, for me, but also potentially can do for human-animal studies. The key thing which drives so much animal welfare science is this fundamental question that I come back to all the time in human-animal studies. What matters to the animal? And what matters in both a bad and a good sense? What makes an animal happy? What makes an animal sad? Oh, terrible anthropomorphization. But you know what I mean. What's good for the animal and what's bad for the animal? How we might know what's good for the animal and what's bad. The whole challenge of knowing. There's an extraordinary area of disciplinary epistemological inquiry. What are the qualified risks of anthropomorphism? How do we deal with our inherent anthropomorphism when we're trying to deal with what really matters to the animal? What I love about animal welfare science is the unequivocal belief in the subjectivity of many animals, the assumption of sentience, the belief that animals have never been machines, that animals have intentionality. And the idea also that animals are never entirely natural. You know, there's nothing very much natural about the pigs in Saint-Brieuc, but they're not unnatural either. How do animals experience the world? And from that, what experiences matter and how? This is the key question for animal welfare science, and I think we can borrow and use a lot of that. This emphasis in mattering, is in many ways the very antithesis of animal science, animal biology. And I guess that's what attracts me to it. As Françoise Wemmelsfelder, one of the great animal welfare scientists of today, I think, who works up in Edinburgh, she said, the mechanistic language of animal biology is simply not designed to expose identity and measure animal feeling. Welfare science, the two words almost seem to sort of challenge each other in that coupling. Welfare science has many dimensions, which include physiological, somatic mattering, psychological mattering, behavioural mattering, affective mattering, naturalistic mattering, and so forth, and so on. Animal welfare science begins with the premise that the welfare, which we might define as the reduction of bad and enhancement of good experience, that the welfare of the individual is something that not only human society wants, obviously, but is something the animal wants too. Animal welfare science is an engaged science, which for so many species starts with an assumption of sentience. Of course, that's something it's always had trouble objectively proving to the degree of scientific rigour that other sciences demand, and there's 2 really interesting books that have been published in the last 2 years which shows the sort of the passion involved in this particular debate about sentience. Marion Stamp-Dawkins' rather controversial book, Why Animals Matter, and the very recent Don Broom's book on sentience and animal welfare. Both fantastic books if you're into this. So this is why, in many ways, animal welfare science is a unique field of study and a significant progression from the ethology of people like Tinbergen and Lorenz, both of whom largely dismissed animal intentionality and were very sceptical, certainly in Tinbergen's case, of our ability to identify animal subjective experience. Now, I've always been impressed by this insistence on subjective experience and intentionality in farm animals particularly, because so much of our contemporary biopolitics never gets that far. Or at least if it does, it approaches the mattering of animals in much broader, almost structural ways, through ethical or relational strategies that treat animals predominantly as categories or even objects of human ordering and relevance. Rare species, disease hosts, conserved species, and so on. Far more rarely are animals treated in any lived or embodied or sentient sense. Now, I have to be careful here. I know it's risky, and in a sense rather purpose-defeating, to maintain that sentience is a necessary prerequisite for biopolitical consideration. Nevertheless, sentience does surely make a difference to that consideration. Now, of course, the great irony here, this is my third irony of the evening, the great irony is this concern for what matters to the animal has been largely born out of the growth of intensive animal husbandry and other forms of animal confinement, whether it be an elephant in a zoo or a kitten in a kitchen. Yet it's these forms of close scrutiny, combined obviously with the force of animal capitalism, as Nicole Shukin would have it, that has given animals a certain kind of subjectification, certainly one they didn't have, certainly intellectually, before. Hence, over its 30-year history, animal welfare science has gone through something of a conceptual U-turn from being concerned with productivity, with matching animal objects to systems. It's now much more about mattering, and increasingly about matching systems to animal subjects. And all of this because the animals have gradually revealed themselves to the scientists as feeling bodies and feeling minds. They've gradually told the scientists what to look for. So if some become concerned about the density of animals within a barn or a housing unit, a claim that a pig or a chicken or a dairy cow needs space, the question is, how do we know that space is important to a cow or a chicken or a pig? How much space matters to them? And critically, how much space do they need or want? Might a young dairy cow, inexperienced as a mother, inexperienced in knowing how to deal with the fact that her calf has been taken away from her after only 24 hours, might she not want to seek the comfort of other cows? And how do the socio-technical networks that constitute the contemporary dairy farm respond to, facilitate or inhibit that? Take play. We may think of animal play in very functionalist terms as the expenditure of body energy, which for an animal is a valuable and costly resource, that is not necessarily directly productive or reproductive. How important is this to the animal? How much does play matter? And how much is the seeking and doing of it the product of a subjective intentionality? We might go further and explore, like Haraway, the role in which animal play helps to constitute our own social relations, both with animals and amongst ourselves. In his essay, The Zoology of Play, Masumi draws on Gregory Bateson's famous essay of 1972 and explores the relationship between a human observer and a playful zoo animal. For Masumi, this interaction, even with all the caveats we might introduce about anthropocentrism and dominance, this facilitates reciprocal expression and offers genuine possibilities for a creative, inclusive and inactive multi-species ecology. Or of course perhaps not, like these wonderful photographs from Gary Winogrand of Central Park Zoo many years ago. I think also of the work of my colleague John Bradshaw, now a regular on television shows you've probably seen about cats and dogs. Now, John studies how much humans and human contact matters to companion animals, as well as mattering to us. How the arrangement of a garden might perturb or worry a pet animal. This is the other side of the relational coin, one that also points the way to a more inclusive politics. Now, of course, in all of this, animal welfare science has been additionally fascinatingly innovative in the development of novel methodological tools to get at what matters to an animal, both in terms of what they don't like and what they do. These methodological tools range from direct observation to free choice profiling, preference testing, avoidance testing, qualitative behavioural analysis, comparative experimental orthology, and so on. It's a whole series of wonderfully innovative methodologies, increasingly complex for assessing how much particular things matter to individual animals. So, we might not know what it's like to be a bat, but we might be able to know what a bat likes. The result is not anthropomorphic, the eternal bugbear of animal behaviourism, in the sense of projecting animal behaviors, human behaviors or feelings onto animals. Rather, it is empathetic, the sense that here are things we have in common. As the primatologist Frans de Waal or the horse trainer Vicky Hearn have each in their own way demonstrated, these human, non-human interspecies communalities operate at and communicate in a number of different levels, from the purely biotic to the material, to the corporeal and the motile, to the affective, to the intentional and the rational. Now, for me as an animal geographer, this has been really heady stuff. It's opened the way for me, certainly, towards, and for others, including Mara, it's opened the way towards a collaborative approach to human, non-human relationalities that does not simply couple humans as exclusively sentient with everything else that is not. A collaborative approach that does not purely rely on our representation about what matters to animals. An approach that does not simply imply or implicitly impose a bias on animals that cannot say a thing. So, to conclude, strangely, almost everything I've talked about this evening folds back to two encounters with John Murdoch. His early advocacy and critical intellectual engagement with A&T at the end of the 1980s, and with Mara, his early association with animal welfare scientists, and really I'd like to thank him for both. I think that collaboration between, on the one hand, animal geography and the social sciences involved in human-animal relations, and, on the other hand, animal welfare science and contemporary and applied cognitive ethology, is a key and necessary step for a creative and progressive human-animal studies. Already, when I look at it, I see hybrid disciplinary forms emerging. I think of the ethno-ethology of people like Dominique Lestel and Florence Brunois. I think of the Anthrozoology Institute set up by the aforementioned TV star John Bradshaw. I think of Hayden Lorimer's entwined biographies of animals and people. I think of the interest in Thelma Rowell's work in giving sheep the opportunity to behave differently. I think of the Israeli ornithologist Amos Zahavi's gabblers, so brilliantly described by Vincent Desprez. I think also of the as yet unchanted possibility of a real cosmo-politics. Common to all of these is a genuine attempt, I think, to achieve a sense of interaction and what Vincent Desprez calls responsible consequences. Now, there's still some work to do. There's still some work to do in convincing animal and veterinary scientists that the role of social science is not simply to provide ethical underpinning to scientific research. We still have to convince them that the role of social science is not merely to convince people to do what scientists tell them. But there is also work to do with our fellow social scientists, to convince them that there is more to the social and to the political than the human. Certainly, I believe it's through collaboration with these engaged animal disciplines that we can move towards achieving some of the promise of an even more radical actor network theory, one that doesn't limit intentionality to human actors. It's through such collaboration that we might realise the greater ambition of human-animal studies and explore the constitution of genuinely more than human multi-species networks, assemblages, cartographies and effects, some of which might only peripherally depend upon human actors. Animals, of course, have their networks too. So if the collective is the political project of A&T, then it cannot be only our collective or the collective on our terms. Latour argues that, and I quote, one must practice sociology in such a way that the ingredients that make up that collective are regularly refreshed. In the sorts of collaborations I've been advocating, there is hope, I think, or there is the hope and the aspiration that such a refreshment might offer a greater symmetry, and with it the possibility of a very different politics. That's it.